Once the design was finalized, the challenge shifted from blueprints to production, and here, America's industrial might revealed itself in full. Assembly lines that once produced sedans and tractors were retooled overnight. By 1942, the factories of Willys Overland and Ford were operating around the clock with men and women working double shifts under glaring lights, their hands blackened by grease and steel dust. The Jeep was no longer just a prototype. It was a flood. The numbers were staggering. By the end of the war, more than 640,000 Jeeps had been built, enough to outfit entire armies, and still have thousands left for training and reserves. At peak production, a Jeep rolled off the line every 2 minutes. Soldiers joked that Jeeps seemed to sprout from the earth, appearing faster than German tanks could destroy them. There was gossip among factory floors, too, workers scribbling notes on dashboards, slipping good luck charms under seats, even signing their names beneath hoods before vehicles shipped out. One young woman in Detroit recalled sewing her brother's initials onto the canvas seat of a Jeep, hoping somehow it would find its way to him. Overseas, another worker, exhausted from a 16-hour shift, whispered that each Jeep felt like a letter we were sending to the boys out there, and those letters traveled far. Created Jeeps were stacked in shipyards like children's toys, awaiting transport to Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. Longshoremen marveled at their compactness. 4 Jeeps could fit into the space of one truck on arrival. They were quickly emboxed, bolted together, and sent racing into combat within hours. For German generals, the scale was unsettling. They had expected America's industrial machine to produce aircraft and tanks, but the flood of Jeeps defied logic. Instead of a few thousand heavy vehicles, millions of light ones spread across continents, stitching together front lines with unprecedented mobility. The war was becoming a contest of scale, and the Jeep proved that sometimes smallness multiplied enough times could dwarf even the largest weapons. As the flood continued, the machine once marked as a toy was turning into a nightmare image. Endless columns of Jeeps rolling down roads, headlights glowing like rivers of stars. It was a sight that carried not just soldiers, but the weight of inevitability on the battlefield. The Jeep became more than a machine. It was a lifeline. Soldiers trusted it not only to carry commanders, but to haul ammunition, tow anti-tank guns, ferry the wounded, and even deliver hot meals to men huddled in trenches. Its versatility was unmatched. A Jeep could serve as an ambulance at dawn, a communications post by midday, and a gun platform at night. To the men who rode in it, the Jeep was a companion that asked for little, yet gave everything. Anecdotes surfaced in diaries and letters. One medic described racing a Jeep across shellac roads to save 3 men who would otherwise have bled out. Another soldier joked that the Jeep was as stubborn as a mule but faster than a horse. In Italy, villagers remembered the sound of Jeeps bouncing into town, headlights off, headlights on, again, carrying wounded men wrapped in blankets. The machine became synonymous with presence where soldiers were in need. A Jeep was not far behind, but its role went beyond utility. The Jeep carried morale. Young GIs named them, painted them with pin-up art or draped them in Christmas decorations during rare holiday lulls. There were whispers of Jeeps converted into makeshift chapels where chaplain preached to soldiers before combat. One officer recalled how during a night lull in Normandy, a Jeep engine idled softly as men sang around it as if the war began with laughter. In the smoky rooms of occupied Europe, German generals scoffed at reports of a peculiar American invention, a squat box-shaped vehicle with a flat nose, spindly, wheels, and none of the armored bulk they associated with military might. To them, it looked like something a farmer would drive to market, not a weapon of war. Their officers joked that if the Americans send these into battle, they might as well deliver bicycles and wheelbarrows. And yet behind the sneers, no one could imagine how such a machine would soon haunt their every campaign. Imagine the scene columns of panzers, rumbling down French roads, engines, growling, the generals confident in their steel beasts, then contrast it with the first jeeps arriving in Britain, tiny silhouettes bouncing across muddy fields, soldiers clinging to the sides, laughing in disbelief at how light and reckless the ride felt. Even Allied soldiers were skeptical at first. Could this flimsy contraption stand up to the brutality of the front? But the laughter would not last long. The Jeep was more than metal and wheels. It was a philosophy in motion. It whispered a truth the Germans had not yet grasped. The coming war would not be won by sheer weight, but by speed, adaptability, and numbers. And so, in the shadow of tanks and bombers, this strange little machine began its journey. From ridicule to legend, the Jeep's story began not on the battlefield, but in the bureaucratic corridors of Washington. In 1940, as Europe burned, and America still debated its role, the U.S. Army issued a desperate call: design a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle that could replace motorcycles and sidecars, one tough enough for war, but nimble enough for any terrain. The specifications were nearly impossible. Under 300 pounds, four-wheel drive, seating for three, a folding windshield, and the ability to climb steep grades. 90 days were given to submit a prototype. 90 days to design what had never existed before. 3 companies answered: Bantam, Willis Overland, and Ford. Bantam, a tiny firm from Pennsylvania, stunned the Army by delivering its prototype, the Bantam reconnaissance car, in just 49 days. Soldiers tested it in mud and rain, splashing through rivers and climbing hillsides where motorcycles had failed. They were amazed, but Bantam was too small to mass produce. Soon, Willys and Ford joined in, improving the design. The Willys Quad, with its powerful Govel engine, outperformed the rest, while Ford's version introduced practical refinements. In the end, all 3 designs merged into one: the standardized Jeep, a blend of Bantam ingenuity, Willys strength, and Ford efficiency. There was gossip in the ranks during testing: young officers sneaking joyrides across bases, racing these strange vehicles at night, even dragging them into mess hall for pranks. One sergeant wrote that he had never seen generals smile so broadly as when bouncing in the passenger seat of a prototype. The Jeep, before it was ever shipped abroad, already carried an air of mischief and freedom. Yet, its creation wasn't just about laughter. Behind every line of welding and engine roar stood a deeper urgency. The Army knew that if America entered the war, soldiers would need mobility like never before. Not just tanks and trucks, but a machine that could go anywhere, any time, under any conditions. As Europe descended further into chaos, this odd little car, born from impossible deadlines and corporate rivalry, was quietly preparing to rewrite the battlefield. The Germans, still confident in their panzers, had no idea that a vehicle designed in less than 3 months would soon be their most underestimated enemy. The genius of the Jeep lay not in brute strength, but in speed and adaptability. At first glance, it seemed absurd. Thin steel panels, an open top that left soldiers exposed to rain and bullets, and a tiny frame that looked fragile next to armored half-tracks. But when tested under real conditions, the little machine defied expectations. It could climb a 60% grade, cross streams without stalling, and weave through forests where trucks got stuck. Soldiers quickly learned that the Jeep's apparent weakness was its greatest strength. It didn't try to overpower the terrain. It danced across it. Reports trickled back. From training grounds in America and Britain, a Jeep could be hauled up ropes, onto ships dropped by parachute, or lashed onto gliders. Mechanics discovered they could strip its engine in the mud and reassemble it in less than 4 hours. Farmers turned soldiers, grinned at its simplicity. Saying it reminded them of tractors back home. One private scribbled in his confiscated diary, "It is not a car, it is a mule." German intelligence at first dismissed such accounts as exaggerations. To them, war machines were measured in tons and armor thickness. But on the ground, why, mock soldiers would soon witness something unnerving. These Jeeps were everywhere. They darted through shell craters, sped across minefields, even raced along railway tracks when fitted with special wheels where German supply columns bogged down in mud. The Jeep zipped past carrying messages, commanders, or medical supplies. There was gossip among Allied camps. 2. Stories of soldiers modifying Jeeps for sheer mischief, strapping machine guns on the back, using them to pull sleds across snowy fields, even hosting impromptu races through bombed-out towns. One general reportedly scolded an officer for abusing equipment, only to ask sheepishly for a ride minutes later. The Jeep's charm was undeniable. It turned even hardened veterans into boys for a moment, but beneath the humor was a deadly reality. The Jeep was fast, enough to appear suddenly and vanish before the enemy could react. It made artillery placement quicker, reconnaissance stealthier, and medical evacuation swifter. The war was shifting from static fronts to fluid mobility, and the Jeep was at the heart of that transformation. By the time generals on both sides began to grasp its significance, the laughter had already faded. What looked like a toy was becoming a tool of strategy, a weapon of speed, and a war of endurance. Factories across America became the beating heart of the Jeep's revolution. The machine itself was part of the ritual of survival for the Germans who faced it. The sight was unnerving. Prisoners captured in North Africa told interrogators that they were shocked by the speed with which Americans shifted troops and supplies. In their words, the battlefield seemed to move too fast, as if the enemy multiplied in every direction. And for us watching today, a question arises. What do we remember more in war? The massive tanks that dominated the front pages, or the humble machines that carried the lifeblood of survival? If you were a soldier, would you rather ride in the steel belly of a tank on the open, fragile seat of a Jeep, feeling the air and danger at once? The Jeep forced such questions in every soldier's mind, and each time the answer was not about power, but about trust. By mid-war, the laughter of German generals had grown thin. Reports from the front described an enemy vehicle that seemed to multiply, endlessly outrunning their convoys and undermining their carefully built defenses. What unnerved the most was not its design, still scorned as crude, but its presence. The Jeep was everywhere at once, a phantom that carried orders, weapons, and men faster than the Wehrmacht could adapt. One captured German officer confessed to interrogators that he could not understand how such a small vehicle could cause so much disruption. In North Africa, Jeeps darted across the desert like insects, carrying British commandos who struck supply depots and vanished into the dunes. In Italy, they crawled up mountain passes that even mules struggled to climb. On the eastern front, Soviet soldiers received thousands through Lendley, where they became prize reconnaissance tools, leaving German patrols baffled at their sudden appearances behind lines. There was gossip among German prisoners, recorded in confiscated notes. Some wrote bitterly that the Americans had too many of these machines, that destroying one meant nothing because 5 more would appear. Others admitted grudging admiration, comparing the Jeep to a swarm of ants, small, fragile, alone, but unstoppable together. Even German generals who once mocked began to alter their tone. Field reports described the Jeep as the enemy's universal machine, a description that carried both respect and dread for them. Accustomed to precision engineering and heavily armored machines, the Jeep represented something alien efficiency through simplicity. Meanwhile, Allied soldiers kept finding new uses. Jeeps became mobile radio stations, frontline, command posts, even platforms for mounting recoilless rifles. Their adaptability made the battlefield unpredictable, and unpredictability is what unnerved the German high command most for us decades later. The irony remains sharp. The same men who dismissed the Jeep as laughable now feared its presence more than some. Tanks. It raises a question for you, watching this today. What do we underestimate in our own time? What small, overlooked invention could quietly reshape the balance of power before we even recognize it? Share your thoughts below. The laughter was gone. Now, in its place stood unease. And in that unease, a dawning realization. This was not a toy. This was a tide. And it was rising. When Allied troops stormed Europe, the Jeep arrived with them. Not in dozens, not in thousands, but in rivers that seemed endless. On D-Day, as men clawed their way onto the beaches of Normandy, crates of Jeeps followed close behind. Within hours, they were unpacked, bolted together, and roaring. Inland, their tires spinning across mud, and rubble where tanks bogged down to weary infantrymen. The sudden appearance of these nimble machines felt like a promise help was never far behind. In the weeks that followed, the flood grew. Columns of Jeeps rolled down French roads, headlights glowing like fireflies in the summer dusk. Civilians stood in or as convoys stretched for miles, Jeeps carrying generals, radio operators, medics, cooks, chaplain, even bands of musicians who played for liberated towns. To many, the sight was more shocking than tanks, for tanks had passed through France before under German banners. But Jeeps were there. Openness and speed felt different, less like conquerors, more like a living tide of movement that would not be stopped. Prisoners of war spoke of their confusion. Some swore the Americans had a magic factory hidden in every forest, producing Jeeps overnight. One diary entry confiscated from a German sergeant simply read, "They arrive faster than we can retreat." There was gossip among Allied ranks, too. Soldiers bet on how quickly Jeeps could be assembled from crates, some managing the task in under 20 minutes. Others painted names of sweethearts or hometowns on hoods, turning each vehicle into a rolling memory of life beyond war. In Paris, liberated crowds cheered not only the tanks that rumbled past, but the swarms of Jeeps that followed, young GIs waving from open seats, their laughter carrying through streets once silenced by fear. The flood was unstoppable. By the winter of 1944, Europe was stitched together by Jeeps, connecting command posts to foxholes, villages to supply depots, soldiers to survival. And in that flood lay a truth no German general could ignore while tanks crushed ground. Jeeps conquered distance, and distance in modern war was everything by the war's final years. The Jeep was no longer a curiosity. It was a symbol etched into the very image of the Allied advance. German officers who had once dismissed it with jokes now watched it roll through conquered cities as a banner of inevitability. Where Jeeps appeared, resistance crumbled not because of firepower but because of what they represented: endless supply, endless Reach, endless momentum. The symbolism extended beyond the battlefield. News. Reels in America showed columns of jeeps, splashing through rivers, scaling hillsides, even carrying generals into liberated towns. Families back home saw them as proof that their sons were never alone, that a small, sturdy companion was always by their side. Children in Europe, freed from occupation, often remembered the open jeeps first. Soldiers tossing candy, handing out food, smiling from behind dusty goggles. To them, the machine carried not only warriors, but liberation itself. There was gossip, too, among the war's survivors. Old soldiers recalled that you could hear victory in the jeeps. Engine, a distinct putter, lighter than trucks, yet constant, reliable. 1P later said that the sound haunted him long after capture because it always meant the enemy was close, always moving, faster than expected. Statistics gave weight to these memories. More than 640,000 produced, shipped across oceans, carried through deserts, jungles, mountains, and ruined cities. They served in every theater, in every climate, under every condition. Few weapons could claim such reach, and yet the jeep was never truly a weapon. It was a thread binding the chaos of war into something coherent, knitting vast armies together into a force that seemed impossible to stop. The Germans had laughed, but the laughter had given way to silence, then to fear, and finally to surrender. When the war ended, soldiers took jeeps home, in their memories. Some even smuggled them onto ships, unwilling to part with what had become both a tool of survival and a friend. The jeep was no longer just a machine. It was a witness, a companion, and a reminder that sometimes the smallest things carry the greatest weight in history. The story of the jeep ends not with thunder, but with a quiet endurance. Long after the guns fell silent, the little machine rolled on, carrying farmers through fields, explorers across deserts, and aid workers into places still healing from the scars of war. It had outlived the conflict that birthed it, proving that its strength was not destruction, but service. Old soldiers often spoke of the jeep in softer tones than they did of tanks or rifles. One veteran confessed that in dreams he still heard the rattling of its engine. At night, a sound that meant safety, movement, survival. Another remembered the way a jeep carried him to a field hospital after a mortar blast, saving a leg that would have been lost in any other war. These were not grand heroic tales of conquest, but small intimate moments where a machine became part of the human story. In Europe, children who once clambered onto jeeps during liberation grew into adults who remembered not the machine itself, but the faces it carried. Dusty soldiers who offered chocolate, bandages, or simply the sight of an open smile after years of silence. For them, the jeep was not a weapon, but a symbol of arrival of life, returning to broken streets. Perhaps that is the final irony. The Germans laughed at the jeep because it looked fragile, unworthy of war, but fragility, multiplied by hundreds of thousands, became unstoppable. What they mocked as weakness became endurance. What they dismissed as a toy became the face of liberation. And so the jeep rests in memory as both tool and companion, a reminder that history is not always shaped by the loudest weapons, but sometimes by the quiet persistence of small things moving steadily forward.